We have to have compassion and understand how hard things are, and not just label somebody and reject them that way, but we need to look at, all of it together.
So here we come back to what people feel. And I want to say this, that the supposition that gender identity is innate and kind of a fixed property aside or independent of biological sex is not supported.
What we're seeing in society as well is, for example, in the education system itself, a lot of teachers, they're not even being taught to be teachers, they're being taught to be activists.
It is devastating to not be recognized. And I want to say two things. One is, part of the rise in numbers is also about the increase of social acceptance.
Well, welcome to Both Sides Now Table Talk, and we're happy that you've joined us. We've got some amazing guests today. We're going to be talking about sex education in the school systems, and it's a strong topic. It's an important topic.
If we're going to teach sex ed, an extreme, in all aspects of educational system, we need to be honest and we need to be truthful. And, it's loving and kind to be truthful. So we need to be telling children that even though you feel this way right now, they may feel like they are lesbian or vice versa or something like that, that statistically heterosexuality and the feeling of male and female and aligned biologically for 99.9% of the population, and gender identity is flexible. It changes over time, especially for children, and even with same-sex attraction, that changes over time, the whole aspect of fluidity. So we need to not lock children into believing that just because they have a thought or feeling, that is going to be who they are or what they become, or we have to be careful with all of that.
But there's a rise in the number of children identifying as trans in this generation as opposed to previous generations. Why do you think that's happening?
When we talk about trans particularly, it has grown astronomically. And I think, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the psychological Bible, so to speak, in 2013, which was the last time it was produced and it's due to come out again, there were only 0.005 to 0.014% of natal males, that's boys, that actually had gender dysphoria. We don't even talk about gender dysphoria anymore, but that's what we need to be talking about instead of this trans, which is a trans trajectory, so to speak. And it was only 0.00030% of girls that identified, not identified, we've got that in mind, that were diagnosed. And it is a diagnosable condition. So things have gotten skewed here because the lines have become very blurred. And so for children, teaching on all of these things is really confusing when such a small percentage of the population actually was diagnosed. What we're seeing now is this rise, exponential rise, in those who are considered self-diagnosing or being diagnosed by teachers and others as transgender, just because, something they exhibit or, all of those things. But there's several reasons that that's happening. We have to be honest with kids. This is very rare. That's not what's being taught. What we're being taught is the gender unicorn, and you can be, and you might be, and that you should question if you're actually a girl. And I don't believe that should be happening.
I strongly object to seeing trans as a disorder. The World Health Organization has declassified it. It still is in the DSM. The World Health Organization has declassified it as a disorder. Britain, France, and Denmark have all declassified it as a disorder. It's not a mental illness. Being trans it's not a mental illness, and I feel very, very strongly that this is putting a stigma, re-stigmatizing people, talking about an identity as something that's wrong with them that they could be treated for. So I have a real problem with that kind of language, and with seeing trans as something that is a mental illness. And many people are starting to see that and to understand that. And as I said, large numbers of people or different countries are starting to see that and not classify it as a disorder.
What we're seeing in society as well is, for example, in the education system itself, a lot of teachers, they're not even being taught to be teachers, they're being taught to be activists. And you're seeing in the schools right now, probably, there's ignorance where there's a strong agenda, pushing, I don't hear that from you, Dr. Horwitz. I don't hear you saying, drive it down some kid's throat and make them feel horrible. But there is that going on because people are saying, we have to push this in there. We have to, for the sake of the people that have been oppressed. And without a clear understanding as to both sides, like you have to hear that. And I think what you're saying is that, again, we're getting reports of 5-year-old children having their parents taking them in for a sex change at 5 years old developmentally, or a 13-year-old girl having her breasts removed. So the whole movement is confusion. And even around the sensitivity, like when you move into teens, peer pressure and wanting to belong. And this is what we're dealing with. And I'm not sure how that gets controlled if you bring in a curriculum, and some teachers definitely are pretty strong activists.
There's a spectrum, just as there is with everything. There are children who at 5 years old know that they're in the wrong body. And there are some children who might feel it now and might change. It's complicated. We can't deny the rights of those children who know, because we fear others. And I think, I'm not a psychologist. I don't know when it's appropriate and I'm not a medical doctor, when it's appropriate to start hormone therapy. I am not going to ever suggest when it's appropriate to have gender affirming surgery. That's not in my realm. What I know is that there are young children who know, and there are young children who go through phases. And so I think the question is more, how do we differentiate between that, rather than saying it doesn't exist? It does exist. And the question is, how do we keep everybody safe, both those children who know and the children who might just be going through a phase? It is very, very hurtful when people often say to queer people, it's just a phase. For some people, it might be. And there are many people who identify differently along the spectrum. But for some of us, when somebody turns around and says, you're a lesbian and it's just a phase, that fundamentally devalues who I am. And there are people for whom it is a phase, and who move through different phases of their lives and happily move from one to the other. And that's great. That is absolutely fine. But don't devalue my experience and who I am, and who people who know, for whom it's not a phase.
And I like that you said, you talked about, safety for all, because that's kind of where it's at right now with sex ed curriculum. What's being proposed right now doesn't appear to be safe for all. It doesn't appear to consider those other variables. Dr. Horwitz, you say it's not fair. They should have support, and they should be able to feel normal, and they should be able to feel loved and accepted. And then the other side says, but is that at the expense of everybody else having to go through that curriculum for that one child, when it actually is causing confusion for other children, and it's actually causing others to be distressed? We don't want either child to be distressed, But also, I think too, maybe let's ask this question: what is gender dysphoria?
Well, it's the feeling that one's emotional and psychological identity as male and female is opposite to one's biological sex. So it's a feeling. So here we come back to what people feel. And I want to say this, that the supposition that gender identity is innate and kind of a fixed property aside or independent of biological sex is not supported by scientific evidence. And so gender dysphoria is a designation. We have a whole language issue in our society, in our culture. And gender identity disorder, which gender dysphoria was previously, and it was a mental illness. Gender dysphoria was a mental illness, and actually It is still in the DSM as a mental illness. The World Health Organization has been suggesting and saying we need to not say it's a mental illness, but I want to say that there are strong contributors, and that children and many of those who are now classifying themselves as transgender. It's not about disrespecting them as a human being, but we need to tell the truth about these girls who particularly are overrepresented with severe adolescent developmental disorders that are at the same time happening with these thoughts that they're in the wrong body. And there's incredible depression, anxiety disorders, self-harming. And people say, well, that's because you're trans. Well, no, those were already pre-existing, and they're negating that reality. The other thing is that these children, many of these young girls particularly, are very susceptible because they're on the autism spectrum. So kind of between 20 and 30% of these who are now saying, I feel like I'm in the wrong body, is they are actually autistic or on some level on that spectrum. We need to look at the mental health of these children, and mental health in our children is absolutely critical because it is right now actually a huge issue.
I think we can all agree that there's mental illness in every sphere of society to some extent. If studies are showing some of this, that might be also the case. And I think what you're saying, Dr. Gillies, is that you don't want to push education, telling somebody it's all normal when perhaps there's areas of their lives that actually need some healing in their lives. And so a child, for example, might go and get reassigned surgery, or they might, they're being told that's because you're trans, when in fact, maybe it is, maybe it's not, but there is something else going on, and that those areas are not getting treated.
Children are literally being pushed into transitioning, and that's happening within the school, for doctors and psychologists, psychiatrists, and I take great exception with that, because we need to look at what is in the best interest of the child, and are we really doing the right thing by these children? And remember that honestly, and this is truthful, up until about 2006, this percentage of the population was very, very minute. And so the growth now is kind of over the top. And I think lots of professionals, psychologists particularly, are going, wait a minute, we have a problem here, and we need to listen to them.
People can be queer and have mental illness. People can be Black and have mental illness. People can be Indigenous and have mental illness. People can be homosexual or heterosexual and have mental illness. That's society. People have comorbidities. People can be queer and have diabetes. People can be straight and have diabetes. These are comorbidities. What the problem is when you diagnose, until 1974, being homosexual was seen as a mental illness. Society has agreed now that homosexuality is not a mental illness. So what I'm saying is, of course, you can be trans and have a mental illness. Of course, you can be queer and have a mental illness. My problem is when you see my transness or my queerness as a mental illness. That's where I put my foot down and will not engage in a conversation. My identity is not a mental illness. Can I have my identity and have a mental illness? Absolutely. Well, do they affect each other? Absolutely. The same way as my diabetes would affect me if I was straight or queer. Of course, these things talk to each other. Of course they do. The point is that my gender preference, my way of life, is not a mental illness. Full stop, end of story.
The point I think that I'm hearing is that, again, you're saying don't label my trans as being mental illness. The greater concern is when young children are being pushed into transition. And I appreciate you say I'm not a doctor, but there are from what I'm hearing, they're pushing more and more pre-pubescence, like where they have the surgery or they start them before they reach puberty. And so my point is this: is if a child perhaps has, because we all know mental illness of any kind can distort different experiences and feelings and beliefs. That's a fact, right? So if a child has other things going on, and then I'm just asking that question, and then they're being directed towards your solution is you're transgender.
I think we're missing a huge issue here, and that is how hard it is to access those health services. You have to see 2 psychiatrists. You have to get 2 psychiatrists to sign off before you can access trans health services. This is not, I come home one day and I say to my mom, I'm trans, and I go and have gender affirming surgery or start onto hormone replacement therapy. This is an incredibly long and difficult process. This is not something people turn around one day and say, oh, I want to be trans and start treatment. In Saskatchewan, our students who identify as trans are waiting 2 to 3 years sometimes to get those 2 signatures. So I think that we're overestimating how easy this is, and we're overestimating that students can just say, okay, or child can just say, okay, I'm trans. You have to see a family doctor. You have to choose 2 independent psychiatrists, and both of those independent psychiatrists have to sign off. And a lot of trans activists have a real issue with this step, because 2 independent psychiatrists have to evaluate you and say there's no other mental illness here. And that is fundamentally important. So it's not just that you flip a switch and start. And what's happening is sometimes that it is so difficult to get access to this treatment. People are going onto hormone replacement therapy outside of the medical system. We lost in South Africa 3 people in the last while because they could not get access to hormone replacement therapy safely. So they got it on the black market. So I think we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is to access this care, and what the processes and what the steps are in place. You are seeing psychiatrists. So if there's something wrong with you, they're going to know it.
I have friends, close friends, whose daughter showed up at home at 18 and informed them just when she turned 18, she was moving out. She had been counseled behind their back while she was underage. And she transitioned very quickly. She's on medication, and she has extreme psychiatric issues that they never did address. I'm just saying, so that actually does happen. That's happened right here in Saskatoon, and I know the family. And so that was a pretty shocking thing. And that's, again, where parents aren't involved in the process. You're saying, that they don't have access to healthcare, but there are things going on, where there are people that want to push it through faster. It doesn't sound like you're saying that, but it does sound like I know that there are people with agendas that are pushing things through faster than you might realize. And this family has been so broken apart because their daughter, which they knew had lots of issues before, she had actually had a head injury. She actually was coached on how to divorce her family. Her family aren't aggressive people. They're very loving, and they would have helped her through this. But she literally made the announcement and had gone through the counseling and she transitioned really quickly. And it wasn't 2 to 3 years for sure. And she was underage. So if they were already transitioning her, they would have been doing it behind the parents' back when she was underage. That wouldn't have even been, in my opinion, where parents aren't involved. And that's another whole issue, because parents don't always know what's going on. And again, it might be parents that have different values, but also the best interest of their child. If a parent knows something about their child or is aware of the health of their child, and the parents are kept out of the loop, I'll give you an example. I work a lot up north with First Nation families, and I'm working with a lot of health districts up there. And one First Nation woman just told me, she's on the Board of Education, and they said parents have no rights. And parents aren't allowed to intervene in these elementary schools. They're not allowed to have say. They're not allowed to sign off on stuff. And she said, did they know what they did to our children when they put us in residential schools and took us away from our parents without our parents' say? They did that then. And now, she said, it's unbelievable because up north, the parents have no say. They don't even know what's going on. And so again, from your experience, you're saying it's not that easy. But from what I've also heard, it actually is. There's stuff going on behind the scenes. And maybe that's why we have to talk about this, because it seems to be kind of either or, but there are real concrete cases of families that are really desperately broken. And there are legitimate issues with their children, and they have no more say.
I think the protocols, as my colleague is saying, are in place, but they are not being utilized. And children are being pushed through. And I mean, some of the children I've talked to, and the parents, it's been really radical. They end up going and just seeing a doctor once, and they are prescribed puberty blockers, and most of the time without their parents knowing. They're encouraged, younger children are encouraged without their parents knowing to socially transition. And so there's all this stuff happening behind the parents' back, and having ongoing mental illness and disorders, and the parents not notified, and the child, they're more susceptible, they're vulnerable to the ideas of, oh, maybe I'm in the wrong body, that's my problem. And so it's really true that they are being pushed through, and more so. And I that breaks my heart. I don't think it should happen, and I don't think anyone really believes it should happen like that. And we're looking at numbers that went from about, in 2006, the number of children who didn't identify they had a disorder at that point in time. It's just now gone to this identification of transgender. But this exponential rise is really, really concerning. And I believe that the trans movement actually is preying on vulnerable children and those who are wounded, those who don't fit. They have other issues going on as well. And if you transition, you're in. And social media, Reddit platforms, all of those kind of things are right there encouraging the kids even to lie to their parents, say they're suicidal. And that's all part of what's happening. So I think there's more to this than possibly might be being acknowledged.
When it comes down to children, whether it be sex education curriculum, we want to protect the children. We don't want to cause harm to one so the other one can feel accepted. We don't want to cause harm to the other one so the other one can be accepted. We don't want to exploit vulnerabilities and right away label it that way and diagnose it that way, and ignoring perhaps if there is mental illness that's not even being addressed, at all. Dr. Gillies, I want to ask this question just in this way. When, from your opinion, okay, so if we move past children, when somebody moves into adulthood, they're not even at that vulnerable age as children, because I think we can all agree that we need to protect the children and come up with some better solutions to support our trans community, to support, that would be, I'd want to see that. But are we labeling people still as it's mental illness?
When you're talking though about mental illness, and then you have to look at the incongruence between, yes, I don't feel like I'm in the right body, or there's something wrong with my body. And we need to compare apples to apples and oranges to oranges. But take for a moment, when you're thinking about some mental illness issues, that appearance disorders, psychologically, there's different disorders that are appearance disorders, so to speak, eating disorders particularly, where someone, a young girl usually, will believe certain things about herself that are totally untrue. And the same with body integrity disorder and the identity disorder, where they are actually want to physically amputate a leg or a limb of some kind because they don't feel that limb belongs, or they don't feel healthy with it. There's a lot of things that we need to look at from the side of mental illness. I know my colleague doesn't want to talk about that, but there's lots of things that create mental illness as well. And so some of those are biological, but many of those are traumas that happened. And that was my specialty, attachment disorders and sexual abuse. And there's so much more here that we have to slow everything down and really, really take a whole lot more into consideration. And just because culture and society and even the World Health Organization, which is highly influenced by LGBT academics, even though they are saying this is no longer a mental disorder, what if it is? And what if we are just ignoring what's happening, even as adults? And you have adults who want to be a 6-year-old now. Okay, you have to shake your head. You're 40 years old. You're not a 6-year-old. We need to start telling the truth. I said before that telling the truth is loving and kind, and it is. And so we have to look at the big picture here and what's going on. An adult can do whatever they want to do. That's certainly true. But that doesn't mean I have to agree with it, or with their illusion or delusion that they could be a 6-year-old in a 41-year-old body. I think let's get some common sense and think about this right through to where it is in completion.
And when we come back to, again, the concept of the solution in schools when we have children, and how do we respect children? How do we respect and provide support to children that might be struggling with how they're feeling and what they're, as Dr. Hort says, what they feel, this is what I know. How do we do that? How do we do that in such a way that doesn't bring confusion to other children? How do we be careful to protect and not exploit people? How, there's all this. How do we, you're saying slow it down just enough to make sure everybody's okay, regardless of what people believe, whether somebody says this is right or wrong. Because I think in adulthood, there's, to me, I don't understand, but I'm thinking there's you do what you want to do in life, and it has nothing to do with, somebody else shouldn't be able to tell you what you can do or cannot do as an adult, and you should respect differences. The whole point is this is moving into where children are changing their bodies and they're hating themselves, and so it does have a consequence that's a little bit more serious, and to slow it down enough to have the conversation and to really protect the best interests of the child, no matter what.
And I'd asked for a copy of the sex ed curriculum, which none of us actually have. The only ones I was able to find online were ones from Britain and France and some of the US. And actually, those were really about tolerance. So I haven't actually seen a curriculum that is pushing as too fast or too far. Of course, there are people who are doing that, but I haven't seen it, and we haven't had access to the curriculum here, so we don't know what is actually being taught in class. So should we slow it down? I don't know, because I don't know what is being taught. What I do know is it is devastating to not be recognized. And I want to say two things. One is, part of the rise in numbers is also about the increase of social acceptance. We have always had trans people in the community. Trans people have ended up married with children because they couldn't be who they were. So the fact that we have got a category of people who were previously highly stigmatized, couldn't get access to medical care, who were a cohort who grew up where it was absolutely taboo to talk about this, where it's not anymore, that makes a big difference. That makes a huge difference. And so, people are coming out and are able to actually talk about it, which makes a huge difference. Of course, the trans community, the queer community is very broad, and I speak for only a group of people who I know. I don't know a single trans person, people who I know, who I actually speak to, who think that being trans is easy or is glamorous or is something that you should do. Maybe there are those people. It is a hard life. People are being killed. People are being murdered because they're trans. They've been beaten up in bathrooms. I don't know people who would say, come, let's all be trans together. This is a very, very hard life. The gender dysphoria that you feel, the way hating your body every time you look at yourself, knowing every time you look at yourself, having to perform a role every single day, it's not an easy life. It's incredibly difficult. And a friend of mine who was able to transition in her 40s finally says for the first time now she can actually start to live her life, because she lived with such a sense of dread every time she looked at the mirror. She called it a monster looking back at her because of how she felt. And so I think that we should be very, very careful when we talk about it being something that people are, just picking up one day and saying, okay, I'm trans. For people who are trans, it is an incredibly difficult life, an incredibly dangerous life. And I think that we need to realize that. And for those people who are stuck in that body, no, we shouldn't slow anything down. Should we make sure that they're okay? Should we give them access to all the resources they need? Should there be psychologists involved? Absolutely. But should we tell them that they have to wait another year or 2 or 3 when they've lived like this all their lives? I think it's cruel. And I think we've seen suicide rates amongst queer people who cannot get gender affirming surgery increase. We've seen all sorts of issues. And so do I think we should protect everybody, queer and non-queer? Absolutely. Do I think that we should tell people that they have to wait when society is just starting to open its doors? No, I think that's even more dangerous.
This is good. I don't know about you guys, but what I so appreciate, like we were able to flush things out, talk about things openly. Again, our audience is having the opportunity to be able to hear both sides and to be able to, because that's what people are thinking. People are thinking both ways. They don't understand everything. And I mean, you just, you poured out your heart here, Dr. Horwitz, too. You're saying it's not an easy life, and somebody isn't pushing to have a hard life. They're not trying to do this. What the things they have to overcome is quite significant, and to make it harder for them and not give them access is actually cruel, as you're mentioning it. And I think that we would all agree there's compassion, and I'm hearing actually from both of you, when we say slow it down, again, that would have to be explored later. What does that look like? Is it going to cause more harm and be cruel, or is it going to be more thorough? But I think I'm hearing that there's an agreement here that we have to look out for the interests of the children. We have to be thorough. We have to protect both sides. We have to have compassion and understand how hard things are, and not just label somebody and reject them that way. But we need to look at, all of it together, and not I'm against you, but it's us together and trying to understand what's taking place.